Housing for the working classes in Victorian London meant, for much of the 1800s, renting a cramped room in a small and unsanitary terraced house, and the East End was characterised by row after row of these two up, two downs. By the end of the century, widespread recognition of the social ills of slum dwellings resulted in authorities building model buildings, tenement blocks, to accommodate Londoners, whilst rows and rows of these small two-up, two-down houses, which lacked even basic sanitation, ventilation and light, were slowly being demolished and cleared away. Standards varied, but many offered cleaner, brighter rooms to rent than old and dirty terraces. But residents of both still lived cheek by jowl. Octavia Hill was a philanthropist landlady who documented her efforts to improve the appalling state of housing. She was a social reformer who took a keen interest in bettering the lives of London's poor and did much to bring about social housing. Distressed by the indifference of landlords to the state of accommodation and the failure of legislation to protect the interests of the poorest members of society, she became a landlady herself and recorded how she managed her tenants. You can find out more about her work in the video Slum Landlords and Nightmare Tenants, available on this channel. Interestingly, she also told of her experience of living in the same communities she aimed to improve, the daily life of residents and conversations she witnessed. Today, you will hear her account of daily life for residents living in one of these East End housing blocks, as well as her concerns for how the poor would adapt to living in tenements. For, despite the wretched condition of London's terraces, they at least allowed for the separation of troublemakers and undesirables instead of being grouped together under one roof. Whilst at the time of this account she didn't live in the worst of these new tenement blocks that London had to offer, and not the most evil she had ever lived in, her story offers a fascinating glimpse into the life of Londoners in 1889. The narrative speaks of the residents' daily struggles, arguments, and gossip, but also paints a picture of a community that cares for its neighbours, paying an interest in problems and offering help where needed, despite personal difficulties. You will discover that, for all the poverty, fighting and harsh words that could be found on the streets of working-class London, there was a spirit of neighbourliness against the face of East End poverty. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us to continue bringing the past alive. It is pretty clear that the working population of London is likely to be more and more housed in blocks, and it is not very profitable to spend time in considering whether this is a fact to rejoice in or to deplore, except so far as the consideration may enable us to see how far the advantages of the change may be increased or the drawbacks diminished. The disadvantages of blocks may be looked upon as transitory, and those which seem quite essential to the block system. The transitory ones are by far the most serious. They are those which depend on the enormously increased evil which grows up in a huge community of those who are undisciplined and untrained. They disappear with civilization. They are, so far as I know, entirely absent in large groups of blocks, where the tenants are the quiet, respectable, working-class families who, to use a phrase common in London, keep themselves to themselves, and whose well-ordered, quiet little homes behind their neat little doors with bright knockers, nicely supplied with well-chosen appliances, now begin to form groups where responsible, respectable citizens live in cleanliness and order. What this life will be in the future will greatly affect London. Under rules they grow to think natural and reasonable, inspected and disciplined, every inhabitant registered and known, school board laws, sanitary laws, and laws of the landlord or company regularly enforced, every infectious case of illness instantly removed, all disinfecting done at public cost. It is a life of law, regular, a little monotonous, and not developing any great individuality, but consistent with happy home life, and it promises to be the life of the respectable London working man. On the other hand, what life in blocks is to the less self-controlled, hardly any words of mine are strong enough to describe, and it is abhorred accordingly by the tidy and striving wherever any, even a small, number of the undisciplined are admitted to blocks, or where, being admitted, there is not real living rule exercised. Regulations are of no avail. No public inspection can possibly, for more than an hour or two, secure order. No resident superintendent has at once conscience, nerve and devotion single-handed to stem the violence, the dirt, the noise, the quarrels. No body of public opinion on the part of the tenants themselves asserts itself. One by one, disheartened, the tidier ones depart. The rampant remain and prevail, and often with a very fair show to the outsider, the block becomes a sort of pandemonium. No one who is not in and out day by day, or better still, night after night. No one who does not watch the swift degradation of children belonging to tidy families. No one who does not know the terror exercised by the rough over the timid and industrious poor. No one who does not know the abuse of every appliance provided by the benevolent or speculative, but non-resident landlord can tell what life in blocks is where the population is low class. Sinks and drains are stopped. Yards provided for exercise must be closed because of misbehaviour. Boys bathe in drinking water cisterns. Washhouses on staircases, or staircases themselves, become the nightly haunt of the vicious, the Sunday gambling places of boys. The yell of the drunkard echoes through the hollow passages. The stairs are blocked by dirty children, and the life of any decent hard-working person becomes intolerable. The very same evils are nothing like as injurious where the families are more separate, so that while in smaller houses one can often try difficult tenants with real hope of their doing better, it is wholly impossible usually to try or to train them in blocks. The temptations are greater, the evils of relapse far greater. It is like taking a bad girl into a school. Hence the enormous importance of keeping a large number of small houses wherever it be possible for the better training of the rowdy and the protection of the quiet and gentle, and I would implore well-meaning landlords to pause before they clear away small houses and erect blocks with any idea of benefiting the poorer class of people. The change may be inevitable. It may have to come, but as they value the life of our poorer fellow citizens, let them pause before they throw them into a corporate life for which they are not ready, and which will, so far as I can see, not train them to be ready for it. Let them either ask tidy working people they know, or learn for themselves, whether I am not right in saying that in the shabbiest little 2, 4, 6 or 8-roomed house, with all the water to carry upstairs, with one little WC in a tiny backyard, with perhaps one dustbin at the end of the court, and even perhaps with a dark little twisted staircase, there are not far happier, better, yes, and healthier homes than in the blocks where lower-class people share and do not keep in order far better appliances. And let them look the deeper into this, insofar as our reformers who trust to inspection for all education are would-be philanthropists or newspaper correspondents who visit once a court or block and think they have seen it. Even our painstaking statisticians who catalogue what can be catalogued are unable to deal with these facts. Those who know the life of the poor know. Those who watch the effect of letting to a given family a set of rooms in a block in a rough neighbourhood or rooms in a small house in the same districts know. Those who remember how numerous are the kinds of people to whom they must refuse rooms in a block for their own sake or that of other know. To the noisy drunkard one must say, for the quiet people's sake, no. To the weak drunkard one must say, you would get led away, no. To the young widow with children one must say, would you not be better in a small house, where the resident landlady would see a little to the children, thinking in one's heart also. And to you, to the orphaned factory girl who would like to keep mother's home together, one feels a less public life safer for the quiet family who care to bring up their children well. One fears the bad language and gambling on the stairs. For the strong and self-contained and self-reliant it may be all right, but the instinct of the others who cling on to the smaller houses is right for them. For after all, the home, the life, does not depend on the number of appliances, or even in any deep sense on the sanitary arrangements. I heard a working man say once, with some coarseness but with much truth, "Gentlemen, think if they put a water closet to every room, they have made a home of it." And the remark often recurs to me for the element of truth there is in it. And there is more decency in many a tiny little cottage in Southwark. shabby as it may be, more family life in many a one room let to a family than in many a populous block. And this is due to two causes. Partly the comparative peace of the more separate home. It seems as if a certain amount of quiet and even of isolation made family life and neighbourly kindness more possible. People become brutal in large numbers who are gentle when they are in smaller groups and know one another. And the life in a block only becomes possible when there is a deliberate isolation of the family and a sense of duty with respect to all that is in common. The low-class people herd on the staircases and corrupt one another, where those a little higher would withdraw into their little sanctum. But in their own little house, or as lodgers in a small house, the lower-class people get the individual feeling and notice which often trains them in humanity. What the future will be for these wilder people, I often wonder. It may be that some landlords will be wise enough to keep small houses standing for a time, till the undisciplined are more trained. There is a sentimental objection which is felt by many to blocks. It is not confined to blocks for working people, though as their town home is their only home, it affects them most. It arises, I think, mainly from two causes. The extreme difficulty, not to say impossibility, of giving to a block home that stamp of individuality which most other homes take from the life of the family that dwells in it, and the power of developing the individual life. The creepers in the backyard, the rabbits the boys feed, the canary the sickly child listens to, the shed for the man's tools, the washing arrangements, or the arbour, are all arranged to suit individual tastes, and for all these the separate house or the small house gives scope. In the block, even the perambulator may be a difficulty. Pets are impossible. The sentimental objection to block life is the small scope it gives for individual freedom. The second is its painful ugliness and uninterestingness in external look, which is nearly connected with the first. T buildings, where I lived for a year, is a pretty red brick building with 5 stories of tenements, 2 sides of a square, and enclosing a good-sized asphalted court. My dwelling consisted of 2 tiny rooms, about 9 feet square, opening into one another. The front door, with its separate number and knocker, opens out of the front room into a common open balcony, and the back door out of the back room into a tiny private balcony, about a yard or so square, leading to the sink, etc. These little balconies are often turned to good account, with flower boxes and hanging baskets, and one woman had rigged up a pigeon house and kept pigeons very successfully there. Each tenement is complete in itself, except for the want of a tap. To fetch water, the tenants have to take their buckets to a common tap on each balcony. Though so small, the rooms are fresh and very clean, brightly coloured and painted once every year. The asphalted court provides a large and safe playground for the children, and the flat roof is utilised for washhouses and a drying ground. Each tenant is bound, in turn, to clean and whiten a part of the balcony and stairs, and each in turn on her fixed day enjoys the use of a washhouse and the roof to dry her clothes. These common rights and duties lead, of course, to endless contention. I may quote the remark of a neighbour on the ferocity of the combatants in a washing day dispute. "Why, they'd tear you to pieces. Bulldogs, I call 'em." In the summer, T buildings was very pretty, with its red brick and white stairs and balconies and flowers in most of the windows. S buildings, in which I also lived for nearly a year, was on a much larger scale, and the rents were higher. The tenants were of the most varied description. The buildings were in the form of a quadrangle, enclosing a very large asphalted square. A few miserable shrubs flourished, or rather decayed, in the centre. The various tenements opened onto steep, ill-lighted staircases and dark, narrow corridors. The rooms inside were a great improvement on those in T buildings, large and well-fitted, with every convenience. But in spite of advantages in this respect, S buildings could not compare with my former quarters. I am convinced that nothing is of more importance to the inhabitants of towns than light and colour. T buildings is built to admit as much air and sunshine as possible, S buildings to exclude them, and I think the great difference I noticed in the cheerfulness and temper of the children must have been largely due to this cause. The very large number of tenements, 200 to 300, destroyed the feeling of neighbourly responsibility and interest which was strong in T buildings, and the narrow resounding passages and stairs made domestic disputes and crying children more disagreeably prominent. The character of a building is also largely influenced by the character of the caretaker in charge, and in this respect S Buildings was unlucky. If indifferent order is kept, and the few regulations are not enforced, the convenience of the majority has to give way to a small element in every community who are entitled to the name of public nuisances. A short sketch of an average day in T Buildings will give some idea of the way of life. At 5 o'clock in the morning, I hear the tenant overhead, Mr. A, getting up for his day's work. His wife, who does a little dressmaking when she can get it from her neighbours, was up late last night. I heard her sewing machine going till 1 o'clock. So he does not disturb her. He is a carman at the goods depot of a railway company and has to be there at 6 o'clock, so he is not long getting his breakfast of tea, bread and butter. But before he has done, I hear a child's cry, and then the sound of a sleepy voice. Mrs. A recommending a sip of tea and crust for the baby. The man, I suppose, carries out the order, for the crying ceases, and I hear his steps as he goes downstairs. At 8 o'clock there is a good deal of scraping and raking on the other side of the wall. This means that my neighbour, Mrs. B, an old woman partly supported by her dead husband's savings, partly by the earnings of 2 grown-up daughters, is raking out and cleaning her stove. Then the door is opened. The dust is thrown down the dust chute, and a conversation is very audibly carried on by 2 female voices. Among other topics is the favourite one of Mrs. A's laziness in the morning, though Mrs. B knows perfectly well that Mrs. A has been up late at work, having indeed repeatedly complained of the noise of the sewing machine at night. And though Mrs. C openly avows that she will not say anything against Mrs. A, as she has always been very nice to her. At 8:30 I hear the eldest child of the A family lighting the fire and dressing her 2 little brothers for school. With the departure of the children there is a lull. At 10 Mrs. A gets up, and at 11 she sallies out to make sundry purchases. Before she goes, however, Mrs. A has a brisk gossip on her threshold with Mrs. C, the tram conductor's wife, who has lucked in to return the head of a loaf borrowed on the previous Sunday night. In the dialogue, which lasts more than 5 minutes, I hear Mrs. B's name repeated a good many times, and catch also the phrase, "spiteful old cat," and I believe that Mrs. B's remarks at 8 o'clock are being now repeated with Mrs. C's artistic variations. Soon after 12, there is a great hubbub of children's laughter and shrieking in the courtyard under my window. The children have returned from school, and they seem to have a good deal of fun together till we begin to hear the mothers calling them in to dinner. In the afternoon a certain torpor falls upon the buildings, only broken by the jingling cans and catcalls of the afternoon milk boys. But this is the favourite time for the women to call upon one another, and I can catch various fragments of conversation relating to the bad turn Mrs. D's illness is taking, to the uncalled-for visit of the curate to a lady who dislikes curates, to the shocking temper of little Maggie, Mrs. C's child, who is reported to be the tease and torment of all the children in the place. Looking out of the window, I do not see the unhappy Maggie, but find myself watching instead a spirited game of cricket between 4 girls on one side and 3 boys on the other. The wickets are chalked up against the wall, and a soft ball is used. The game, however, collapses, for the boys, who are smaller than their opponents, refuse to go on, saying, "It isn't fair," and the girls retire triumphant, but disgusted. At 6 o'clock, a row in the street calls a crowd of the inhabitants out onto the balconies, where we can look down exactly as from boxes in a theatre onto the stage. The parties to the quarrel are a man and his wife, in a distinctly lower walk of life, like all the inhabitants of houses in the street, than any of the tenants of the buildings. They are eventually separated after much Old English on both sides. The general impression among the spectators is in favour of the man, but the incident is soon forgotten. Very soon after, various savoury smells begin to float out onto the landings. The favourite meal of the day, the tea, is being prepared against the husband's return. All is comparative peace and harmony. The children's hands are washed, the room is tidied, and the cloth laid. The A's have sprats, as I have good reason to know. Mrs. A is aware of my partiality for this fish, and in a neighbourly spirit sends me in a plateful by her most careful child. from whom I learn that Mrs. D is much worse and wandering in her head, and that Mother is going to sit up with her. Mrs. D's husband is a night watchman, so he is at hand by day to look after her, and the neighbours are taking turns to nurse her at night. In the evening, some of the men go out to the neighbouring club and sing songs or talk politics. One or two drop into the bar of the favourite pub, but the majority simply stay at home with the wife and children. Mr. A, the carman, is essentially a family man, and he makes a point of going through some gymnastic tricks with his boys and putting them to bed. Occasionally he receives a visit from a mate, but this is rare, and generally he retires not later than 9:30. Mr. O, the tram conductor, has a liking for the Star, and reads aloud striking passages after tea. A not infrequent incident in S buildings about midnight or later would not have been tolerated in T buildings. A man there on several occasions went to bed and locked out his wife, who returned home doubtfully sober. To her repeated knocks and entreaties he maintained a sullen silence. Then, exasperated, she thumped and kicked at the door, screaming, and rejoiced when a sarcasm at last evoked a reply. The whole side of the building must have been awakened, but nobody made the least sign. It was not etiquette. In T buildings, the quarrelling was more decent. Such disturbances would lead to general complaints of the offenders, and they would soon be expelled. The advantages of living in buildings, in my opinion, far outweigh the drawbacks. Cheapness, a higher standard of cleanliness, healthy sanitary arrangements, neighbourly interaction both between children and between the grown-up people, and, perhaps above all, the impossibility of being overlooked altogether or flagrantly neglected by relatives in illness or old age seem to be the great gains, and the chief disadvantage, the absence of privacy and the increased facility for gossip and quarrelling, though it may sometimes be disagreeably felt, introduces a constant variety of petty interest and personal feeling into the monotony of daily life.